Long before any scripture was inked or any temple stone was set, there was a morning when the sky itself appeared to break open above a fertile plain, and cities vanished in an instant, leaving behind silence, salt, and a memory too terrifying to name. Why did ancient witnesses describe fire falling from the heavens as if it were deliberate? Why was the land afterward so poisoned that nothing would grow for centuries? Why were survivors warned not to look back, as though sight itself could kill? Why does this account resemble modern descriptions of weapons humanity claims to have invented only recently? And why do echoes of this destruction appear not in one culture, but across many? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The valley once known as the Kikkar was not always a wound in the earth. Long before its waters turned heavy and lifeless, before salt crystals crusted the shoreline like frost, this low basin near the Jordan River was described as a place of abundance, a green bowl cupped between hills, streams braided through fields, palms cast shadows over irrigation channels, and trade routes converged where caravans rested before crossing harsher lands. It was the kind of terrain that quietly shapes power, because whoever controls fertile corridors controls movement, food, and time itself. The Dead Sea of today, dense and silent, sits like a scar over something that ended violently. Ancient memory preserves this contrast with unsettling clarity. Texts speak of a land like the Garden of the Lord, an image that does not mean mythic perfection, but careful cultivation, ordered water, predictable harvests. 5 cities rose here, bound not only by geography, but by shared infrastructure and commerce. Their names survived because their end was sudden enough to freeze them in memory. When destruction comes slowly, it erases names first. When it comes all at once, names remain like labels on bones. Even at a distance, the region feels wrong. The air shimmers with heat that presses downward, and the silence carries weight. Standing near the southern basin of the Dead Sea, one senses that this is not merely an old lake, but the lowest exposed point on land, a place pulled downward by unseen forces. In ancient thought, low places were often associated with judgment or confinement, not because of superstition, but because floods, fumes, and disease naturally gathered there. Yet this basin did not flood into fertility. It collapsed into sterility. The story of 2 messengers arriving at dusk enters here without ceremony. They are not described with wings or halos, only as beings who move with authority and unsettle those who see them. In the ancient Near East, the word translated later as angel meant simply a bearer of command, someone carrying the will of a higher power. Such figures appear throughout early records as inspectors, envoys, or heralds, and their presence usually precedes change, not comfort. When they enter a city, something is about to be decided. Lot's reaction is immediate and instinctive. Hospitality in the desert world was not politeness, it was survival law. To refuse shelter was to invite blood feuds and divine consequence alike. Water for feet, bread for strength, shade for the night. These gestures formed a contract older than kings. That contract is why the violence that follows feels so extreme. The crowd that gathers does not merely threaten strangers, it violates the one rule that held fragile societies together. The text preserves this moment with disturbing bluntness, as if insisting that whatever comes next cannot be separated from what the city has become. Then the narrative shifts tone. Power reveals itself, not gradually, but instantly. The crowd is struck with blindness, a condition described not as darkness but as disorientation, men groping for a door they cannot find even while standing before it. In modern terms, it reads less like disease and more like neurological disruption, the kind that scrambles perception without extinguishing sight. Ancient writers had no vocabulary for such effects, only metaphors drawn from fear. Inside the house, urgency replaces chaos. There is no debate, no attempt at reform, no warning issued to the city as a whole. The command is evacuation. Anyone connected by blood or allegiance is to be removed immediately. The instruction not to linger in the plain is repeated with unusual force, as though remaining at low altitude would be fatal. The landscape itself is suddenly hostile, not morally but physically. Dawn breaks, and the world ends. Fire and sulfur fall from the sky, not as scattered lightning but as something sustained and overwhelming. Sulfur, known in antiquity as brimstone, burns hotter than wood and releases choking fumes. It was used in rituals of purification precisely because it left nothing living behind. Combined with fire, it becomes a weapon against land itself. The text emphasizes totality. Cities, inhabitants, vegetation, all erased together. This is not conquest. It is sterilization. From a distant ridge, Abraham watches. He is far enough to survive, close enough to witness. What he sees is not flames licking rooftops, but smoke rising like that of a furnace, thick and vertical, as though pulled upward by force. Anyone who has seen industrial combustion recognizes this image instinctively. Ancient kilns produced similar columns, but never on such a scale. The comparison suggests magnitude beyond normal fire, something that altered air and light simultaneously. The fate of Lot's wife lingers because it resists easy symbolism. She does not die by fire. She becomes something else, a standing residue. Salt in this region is not just seasoning, it is death to soil. Fields oversaturated with it turn white and hard, rejecting seeds year after year. To become a pillar of salt is to become a marker of permanent exclusion from life. Whether this describes literal mineralization or a body encased in crystallized fallout, the image conveys the same truth. The boundary was crossed too late. For centuries, this account was treated solely as moral warning. Yet morality alone cannot explain why the region never recovered. Archaeological surveys show long gaps in habitation, as if people instinctively avoided the area long after memory of the event faded. Land abandonment on this scale usually follows contamination, salinization, or something that lingers invisibly. Ancient farmers were practical. They did not leave fertile ground unless it stopped being fertile. The modern world gained a new lens in the 20th century, one that retroactively sharpened old descriptions. Weapons capable of turning cities into smoke columns, of blinding observers at a distance, of rendering soil unusable for generations, entered human reality. Along with them came warnings not to look at the flash, not to remain downwind, not to return too soon. Instructions that once sounded theological began to sound procedural. This does not require ancient writers to have understood physics. It requires only that they witnessed effects and preserved them with the tools they had: metaphor, repetition, awe. When technology exceeds language, language reaches for the divine. Fire from heaven is not a claim about gods. It is an admission of incomprehension. What follows this destruction is equally telling. The narrative does not linger on rebuilding. There is no return, no cleansing, no redemption of the site. Attention shifts elsewhere, as though the land itself has been written off. In history, that kind of silence often marks places where something went wrong enough that no one wanted to remember details, only consequences. The plain that once fed cities becomes a warning embedded in geography. The water turns bitter, the ground turns white, and stories compress into parables because specifics are too dangerous to preserve. When later cultures inherit the account, they inherit fear without context, judgment without mechanism. But beneath the moral frame lies a consistent physical pattern: sudden annihilation, extreme heat, lingering toxicity, and strategic survival based on distance and direction. The valley remembers even when people forget. Salt does not lie, and neither does empty land where cities should be. Whatever ended life there did not merely punish behavior. It rewrote the environment. That kind of power, once glimpsed, never fully disappears from human imagination. It waits, dormant, until a new age finally recognizes its shape. To understand why such destruction might have occurred, it becomes necessary to step backward beyond the valley and beyond the text that preserved its end. Far to the east, between the slow curves of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, another civilization was already ancient when the cities of the plain were thriving. Sumer did not imagine its beginnings as a gradual human achievement. It remembered arrival. Its earliest records speak of beings who descended, who measured land, who established order with knowledge that did not grow organically from trial and error. The tone of these accounts is administrative, not mythic, as if the writers were cataloging events rather than inventing them. The Sumerians wrote on clay because clay endures fire. Baked tablets survive floods, wars, and centuries of neglect. On these tablets appear the Anunnaki, a term that means those who came from heaven to earth. This phrase is often dismissed as symbolic, but in its original context, it functions more like a job description than a metaphor. These beings are described as rulers, judges, engineers, and overseers. They assign tasks, distribute resources, and enforce hierarchy. They argue, plot, and punish. They are not omnipresent or omniscient. They move from place to place. Sumerian kingship itself was said to descend from the Anunnaki. This did not mean divine right in an abstract sense. It meant that authority was delegated. Kings ruled because they were appointed, instructed, and monitored. The earliest law codes read less like philosophy and more like operational manuals, emphasizing order, measurement, and consequence. Civilization, in this framework, was not discovered. It was installed. Among these figures, two names recur with particular intensity: Enlil and Enki. Enlil is associated with command, atmosphere, and decree. The word often translated as wind in his name does not mean breeze but force, the invisible pressure that moves things whether they consent or not. Enlil's domain is structure and control. He is the one who enforces boundaries and punishes overreach. Enki, by contrast, is linked to water, depth, and cunning. His wisdom is practical, experimental, and adaptive. Where Enlil issues orders, Enki finds solutions. This tension between command and creativity shapes every major event in Sumerian memory. Even creation itself is described not as a miracle, but as a labor problem. The lower-ranking Anunnaki, the Igigi, are exhausted from maintaining the world's infrastructure. They mine, they dig, they build. Eventually, they rebel. The response is not annihilation, but innovation. Enki proposes creating a new worker by modifying a creature already present on Earth. The language used resembles mixing, binding, and imprinting, terms familiar to anyone who understands breeding or early genetic manipulation. Humanity enters the record not as a crown of creation, but as a solution. The Sumerian word, often translated as man in these passages, carries the connotation of laborer. Humans are designed to bear burdens, to free their creators from repetitive work. This does not strip the story of dignity. It gives it function. Humans are valued because they are useful, and usefulness implies intent. Once established, humans multiply faster than anticipated. Their noise becomes a problem. In ancient texts, noise does not refer to sound alone, but to disruption, unpredictability, and autonomy. Enlil grows hostile. Enki remains protective. This disagreement culminates in a flood, another event that appears in multiple cultures with striking consistency. Again, Enlil chooses eradication. Again, Enki circumvents it by warning a human loyal to him. Survival depends on allegiance, not virtue. This pattern matters because it reframes later destruction. When cities are eliminated, it is not because humanity is inherently corrupt, but because alliances shift. Loyalty determines fate. From this perspective, sin is not moral failure, but political betrayal. To align with the wrong authority is to invite annihilation. As time passes, the Anunnaki do not remain united. Their descendants inherit not only power, but resentment. The second generation grows up on Earth, not on the distant world their elders came from. They are acclimated, invested, and ambitious. Among them, one figure stands apart: Marduk, son of Enki. He is not content with a subordinate role. He understands humans not as tools, but as a base of support. Where others demand obedience, he offers favor. Marduk chooses Babylon, a city positioned at a crossroads of rivers and trade, as his center. From there, he teaches astronomy, calendar systems, and ritual order. These are not spiritual gifts in the abstract. They are technologies of prediction and coordination. To control time is to control agriculture, taxation, and war. Marduk's rise is quiet, but relentless. He does not overthrow, he accumulates. To Enlil and his son Ninurta, this is intolerable. Ninurta is the enforcer, a figure associated with weapons and campaigns. He is celebrated in hymns as a hero who crushes mountains and enemies alike. His violence is not chaotic. It is precise. He exists to restore order when it is threatened. The world, at this point, becomes a chessboard. Cities align themselves not only with trade partners, but with divine patrons. Geography acquires strategic meaning beyond economics. The fertile plain near the Jordan is no longer just land. It is a corridor. It leads toward the Sinai Peninsula, a region described in Sumerian texts as a bond between heaven and earth, a place of ascent and descent. If such a facility existed, it would have required protection. Buffer zones would be established. Loyal settlements would guard approaches. In this light, the cities of the plain are no longer peripheral. They are forward positions. Their allegiance matters. When messengers arrive in one of those cities, They are not tourists. They are auditors. Their withdrawal of a single family suggests targeted extraction, not compassion. Once assets are secured, elimination follows. The scale of the destruction reflects panic. Conventional means are insufficient. Something final is chosen. In Sumerian language, the weapons used are described as winds, storms, and radiance, terms that blend natural force with intent. The evil wind that follows is not immediate death, but lingering consequence, a cloud that moves, settles, and sickens. Here the stories of the valley and of Sumer intersect. The same kind of aftermath appears in both: land abandonment, poisoned water, delayed death. The same insistence on distance, on not remaining, on not looking. These are not moral commands. They are survival instructions. When later civilizations inherit fragments of these accounts, they strip away context and preserve warning. Fire becomes judgment. Smoke becomes sign. But beneath the theology, the memory of technology remains, distorted but persistent. The destruction of the cities of the plain was not an isolated act of wrath. It was a maneuver in a much larger conflict, one that reshaped civilizations and rewrote the hierarchy of gods. Once such power is used, it cannot be unlearned. Those who witness it carry the knowledge in silence. Those who come after inherit only stories, and stories, over time, become scripture. Yet the land itself continues to testify, long after belief has shifted. Sterile soil is an argument no myth can erase. When power fractures at the top, its violence rarely announces itself immediately. It gathers first in councils, in accusations spoken as policy, in decisions framed as necessity. The Sumerian tablets describe such moments with unsettling calm, recording debates among gods the way later scribes would record disputes between kings. These were not beings acting on impulse. They convened, weighed outcomes, and authorized force. War, in this context, was administrative. The division between Enlil's faction and that of Enki hardened over time, but it was the ambitions of their sons that transformed tension into catastrophe. Ninurta, heir to Enlil's authority, embodied discipline and enforcement. His myths describe battles against creatures symbolizing chaos, but beneath the symbolism lies a consistent image, a commander deploying overwhelming force to neutralize threats before they spread. He is praised not for mercy, but for effectiveness. Victory, in his narratives, is measured by silence afterward. Marduk, by contrast, cultivated loyalty rather than fear. Raised on Earth, surrounded by humans from the beginning, he understood something the older generation underestimated: numbers matter. Humans reproduced rapidly, organized socially, and remembered favors. Where Enlil saw noise, Marduk saw potential. He positioned himself not as distant ruler, but as champion, walking among cities, accepting temples, offering stability in exchange for allegiance. This was not rebellion in the open sense. It was infiltration. As Babylon rose, the balance of power shifted perceptibly. Economic influence followed ritual centralization. Priests trained under Marduk developed increasingly precise astronomical records, allowing agricultural cycles and religious festivals to align. Control of time became control of trust. When crops followed prediction, belief followed authority. Other gods' temples did not fall, but they became secondary, absorbed into a hierarchy that quietly placed Marduk at the top. For Enlil's council, this was an existential threat. Authority based on decree cannot compete with authority reinforced by daily benefit. The old order relied on obedience inherited from fear of punishment. The new order promised reward. History shows which model spreads faster. Strategically, the Sinai Peninsula became the focal point. Ancient descriptions of it emphasize ascent, fire, and boundary. It is portrayed as a place no one enters casually, a zone marked by warning and exclusion. Whether imagined as a launch complex, a communications hub, or a logistical center, its importance is consistent across traditions. Whoever controlled Sinai controlled access between domains. The cities of the Jordan Plain occupied the southern gateway to this region. Their prosperity was not accidental. They sat astride routes that mattered to gods as much as to merchants. Alignment with Marduk would have offered him a staging ground dangerously close to Enlil's last secure infrastructure. From a military perspective, this was intolerable. The decision to eliminate these cities was not framed as punishment, but as containment. Sumerian texts speak of releasing the 7 winds, a phrase that suggests coordinated deployment rather than natural disaster. Wind, in these records, is not weather. It is force in motion, invisible yet decisive. The evil wind that follows is not immediate impact, but aftermath, something that travels, settles, and corrupts. Before such weapons were unleashed, reconnaissance occurred. The visit to the city, the extraction of specific individuals, the insistence on rapid evacuation all fit a pattern familiar in modern conflict. Assets are removed. Civilians are warned selectively. The target is neutralized without negotiation. Even the instruction not to look back reflects understanding of blast physics, not spiritual obedience. Exposure, not curiosity, is the danger. The destruction itself unfolds in layers. First comes the flash, described across cultures as unbearable light, a false sun rising from the ground, light so intense it erases shadow and sears sight. Then the heat, instantaneous and total, exceeding anything generated by conventional fire. Stone deforms, sand liquefies, organic matter ceases to exist as structure. This is not burning, it is phase change. The shockwave follows, a wall of compressed air moving faster than sound, pulverizing walls and bodies alike. Structures collapse outward, not inward, leaving debris patterns that confuse later excavators until physics explains them. Human remains are fragmented, scattered, sometimes fused with surrounding material. Death is simultaneous, not sequential. After this comes silence, brief and unnatural. Then the column rises. Smoke, dust, vaporized minerals, and chemical residue climb vertically, forming the furnace-like plume described by distant witnesses. This is the signature of immense energy release. Ancient observers lacked terms like convection column or mushroom cloud, but their metaphors are exact enough to recognize. What makes this event uniquely devastating is what comes after. The wind shifts. Fallout spreads. Particles invisible to the eye settle into soil and water. Crops fail, not because they were burned, but because the ground itself has changed. Salt concentrations spike. Minerals toxic in high doses infiltrate fields. For generations, nothing grows. This explains a puzzle long noted by archaeologists: the sudden abandonment of fertile zones without evidence of prolonged warfare. People leave and do not return. Memory of danger outlasts memory of cause. Stories become warnings: cursed land, forbidden valley, place of judgment. Practical avoidance becomes moral narrative. The same pattern appears in Sumer. Lamentation texts do not dwell on battle, but on sickness, paralysis, bleeding, and despair. These are not wounds from blades. They are symptoms of exposure. The gods themselves flee, not from enemies, but from consequences. They retreat to higher ground or sealed spaces, described as deep chambers or apsu, places of protection below the surface. This is the moment when control is lost. Weapons capable of erasing cities do not respect borders. The evil wind does not distinguish loyalty. It moves according to atmospheric law, not divine command. The fallout reaches cities that were never targets, poisoning the heartland of Enlil's own domain. Victory collapses into self-inflicted ruin. The irony is absolute. In attempting to prevent Marduk's ascent, Enlil's faction devastates its own civilization. The south of Mesopotamia declines rapidly. Agriculture fails. Urban centers empty. Political authority dissolves. Meanwhile, Babylon, positioned outside the path of the spreading contamination, survives intact. History often records outcomes without causes. Sumer's fall appears sudden and inexplicable when stripped of these narratives. But when read alongside the account of the valley's destruction, a coherent pattern emerges. Both are chapters of the same conflict, separated by distance but bound by technology. From this point forward, the gods change how they interact with humanity. They withdraw. Direct intervention becomes rare. Authority shifts from presence to symbol. Temples replace visits. Law replaces command. Memory of the fire is preserved, but its mechanism is buried beneath theology. Yet the land remembers. In the Jordan Plain, in southern Mesopotamia, and in the silent stretches of Sinai, geography bears witness. Sterile earth, abandoned cities, and lingering taboos mark places where power exceeded restraint. These are not myths etched onto the world. They are scars. Civilizations rise and fall, but the consequences of unleashed force do not negotiate. They spread, they linger, and they teach. Those lessons, learned once at unimaginable cost, echo forward until another age believes itself wiser and stands again at the edge of the same decision. Long after the smoke thinned and the poisoned winds settled, the destruction remained embedded in the earth itself, waiting for hands patient enough to uncover it. Centuries passed, empires rose and vanished, and the story of the cities of the plain hardened into theology. Yet beneath layers of dust and silence, the ground preserved a more literal account. Archaeology does not interpret intention, it records aftermath. When soil, stone, and bone speak the same language, belief becomes secondary to evidence. For generations, scholars assumed the lost cities lay beneath the southern waters of the Dead Sea. The idea was intuitive. If the land collapsed, it must have sunk. Expeditions dragged nets across briny depths, mapping submerged ridges and anomalies, but nothing resembling urban ruin emerged. The bottom yielded mud and salt, not walls. The absence itself was telling. Entire cities do not simply dissolve into water without trace, unless something far more violent than flooding has occurred. Attention eventually shifted eastward toward the Jordanian plain. There, rising from farmland like a low artificial hill, stood tall el-Hammam. Locals had long known it as a mound of ruins, a tell built layer upon layer by human occupation. What distinguished it was scale. It dwarfed nearby sites, including Jericho, and occupied a commanding position overlooking the ancient Kikkar. If a dominant city had ruled this region, this was the place. Excavations revealed a metropolis of the Middle Bronze Age, fortified with massive mud-brick walls, towers, gates, and administrative buildings. This was not a village. It was a capital, dense with population and economic activity. The city thrived for centuries, showing continuity and expansion. Then, abruptly, it ended. The destruction layer was unmistakable. More than a meter thick, it consisted of pulverized brick, ash, charcoal, and debris fused together chaotically. This was not the residue of siege or accidental fire. Conventional warfare leaves patterns: arrowheads, collapsed walls inward, sequential burn layers. None of that appeared here. Instead, walls were flattened outward, as if struck by immense pressure. Bricks were not stacked or toppled, they were fragmented. Among the most unsettling finds were shards of pottery transformed into glass. Ceramic vessels normally fire at temperatures below 1,000 degrees Celsius in ancient kilns. To melt their surfaces into glossy vitrification requires more than twice that heat. No Bronze Age technology could produce such temperatures in open air. Even more revealing was the pattern. The outer surfaces of vessels were vitrified, while interiors remained relatively intact. This indicates exposure to an external heat pulse, brief but extreme, arriving from a single direction. Mudbricks showed similar anomalies. Their surfaces had bubbled and deformed, a sign that the silica within them had partially melted. Embedded within the destruction layer were microscopic spherules of iron and silica. Tiny droplets formed when material vaporizes and then cools rapidly while airborne. Such spherules are known from meteor impacts and nuclear detonations. They do not form in ordinary fires. Further analysis uncovered shocked quartz, sand grains bearing microscopic planar fractures that occur only under immense, instantaneous pressure. These features require forces measured in gigapascals, far beyond tectonic stress or human engineering of the time. The presence of shocked quartz alone narrows possible causes dramatically. It points to either cosmic impact or a high-energy explosion. Human remains told the same story. Skeletons were not found in orderly burials or even clustered collapse positions. Bones were shattered, disarticulated, and scattered across the layer, sometimes reduced to fragments too small to reconstruct. In some cases, partial skeletons appeared fused with debris, suggesting simultaneous exposure to heat and pressure. Death here was not personal or sequential. It was immediate and indiscriminate. Salt concentrations in and around the site were anomalously high. The soil itself had been infused with salinity far beyond natural levels for the region. This explains why the area remained uninhabited for centuries afterward. Agriculture cannot resume in land so saturated. Seeds germinate and die. Fields whiten and crack. Farmers abandon them not because of fear, but because effort yields nothing. In 2021, a multidisciplinary team of scientists proposed a model to explain all observed evidence, a high-altitude airburst caused by a cosmic object exploding above the city. Such an event would release energy equivalent to multiple megatons, generating a thermal pulse exceeding 2,000 degrees, followed by a shock wave powerful enough to flatten structures and pulverize bodies. Occurring over or near the Dead Sea, it would vaporize hypersaline water and deposit salt and minerals over the surrounding plain. This explanation fits the data. It also mirrors historical precedent. In 1908, a smaller airburst over Tunguska in Siberia flattened thousands of square kilometers of forest without leaving a crater. Scale that event upward by orders of magnitude, place it over a populated Bronze Age city, and the result matches tall el-Hammam precisely. Yet scientific models describe how, not why. They explain mechanism, but not selection. Cosmic objects do not target capitals while sparing others nearby. They do not prompt evacuations or align with ancient warnings. They do not produce stories of messengers or instructions not to look back. The physical event may be natural or artificial, but the narrative surrounding it suggests anticipation, not accident. The resemblance between airburst effects and nuclear detonation is not incidental. Both involve rapid energy release, extreme heat, shock waves, and fallout. From the perspective of those on the ground, the difference is meaningless. A megaton is a megaton. Stone melts, flesh vaporizes, land dies. If an advanced civilization possessed the means to trigger or direct such an explosion, whether through weaponry or manipulation of natural objects, the archaeological record would look exactly as it does. Total destruction without crater. Directional heat, widespread contamination, long-term abandonment. What remains striking is the consistency between ancient description and modern forensic evidence. Fire from the sky, smoke like a furnace, salted land, sudden end, no rebuilding. These are not poetic flourishes. They are accurate observations encoded in the language available at the time. The excavation of Tall el-Hammam does not prove divine war or extraterrestrial conflict. Archaeology rarely proves intention, but it does confirm that something occurred here that exceeded all known Bronze Age disasters. It confirms that the story preserved in text is anchored in physical reality. Once evidence anchors memory, myth loses its power to dismiss. The question shifts from whether the destruction happened to what circumstances allowed it to happen. When science and ancient narrative align, they do not cancel each other. They deepen the mystery. The ground beneath the ruins does not preach. It does not judge. It only records. And its record tells of a moment when energy beyond human scale erased a city in an instant, and left behind a silence that endured for centuries. Whatever hand guided that moment, the result was final, precise, and catastrophic enough to etch itself into both earth and memory. As the ruin settled into silence and the poisoned soil rejected new life, something equally profound was happening far from the blast zone. Power was rearranging itself. Catastrophe does not simply erase, it redistributes. In the aftermath of annihilation, absence becomes opportunity, and those positioned just beyond the reach of destruction often inherit the future. South of the Dead Sea, the land became unusable. Eastward, Sumer staggered under the weight of the malignant wind. Cities that had stood for centuries emptied in a matter of years. Administrative centers collapsed not because enemies invaded, but because food systems failed and populations fled. The carefully balanced machine of early civilization seized up. This vacuum did not remain empty for long. North of the fallout's path, Babylon endured. Its fields were spared, its temples intact, its population largely unharmed. While other cities mourned and starved, Babylon absorbed refugees, knowledge, and displaced elites. Survivors carried skills, myths, and loyalties with them, and these assets accumulated where stability still existed. Catastrophe had not chosen Babylon, but geography had favored it. Marduk's rise accelerates precisely at this moment. Earlier, his influence had been contested, restrained by older centers of authority. Now those centers lay in ruin. Temples once devoted to Enlil and his lineage were abandoned or diminished. priestly schools scattered, records ended abruptly. Into this void stepped a god whose city still functioned, whose priesthood still taught, and whose narrative could explain the unexplainable. The tool for this consolidation was not conquest but cosmology. A new story emerged from Babylonian scribal culture, a text that did not deny the old gods but reorganized them. The Enuma Elish, often read as a creation myth, is better understood as political architecture encoded in poetry. It presents a universe in crisis, ruled by older chaotic forces unable to govern effectively. Into this disorder steps Marduk, young, decisive, and overwhelmingly powerful. The structure of the story mirrors the recent past with unsettling precision. The older gods debate and hesitate. Authority is fragmented. A threat emerges that none can face alone. Marduk offers a solution, but at a price. Total authority once victory is achieved. Desperate, the gods agree. Power is centralized. Order is restored. The universe is reorganized under a single command. In this narrative, Marduk does not seize control illegitimately. He is granted it. This distinction matters. It reframes dominance as responsibility rather than rebellion. Those who accept the story accept the new hierarchy as necessary, even benevolent. Memory of the disaster becomes justification for centralized power. Fragmentation, the story implies, nearly destroyed everything. The gods of the old order are not erased. They are reassigned. Enlil, once supreme, becomes an elder figure whose authority has passed. Enki becomes a wise counselor, brilliant but secondary. Their earlier roles are acknowledged but contained. Marduk absorbs their titles, their functions, and even their names. When he receives 50 names at the story's conclusion, each one represents a former power now consolidated under him. On Earth, this theological shift translates directly into governance. Babylonian kings rule as representatives of Marduk, enforcers of cosmic order. Law becomes sacred not because it is fair, but because it reflects the structure of the universe itself. The famous legal codes that emerge in this period are framed as restorations of balance, echoes of divine victory over chaos. Meanwhile, the memory of the destruction is reshaped. In Babylonian tradition, it becomes a warning about rebellion against rightful authority. Chaos invites annihilation. Order preserves life. The lesson is clear and politically useful. Those who question the hierarchy risk repeating catastrophe. Yet not everyone accepts this version of events. Other groups carry different memories, fragments of older loyalties that survived the collapse. Some remember Enlil not as a failed ruler, but as a wronged authority. They remember fire from the sky not as a triumph of order, but as a terrible excess. These memories do not vanish, they migrate. One such lineage traces itself back to a man who witnessed the destruction from afar. Abraham, traditionally remembered as a nomadic patriarch, originates from Ur, one of the cities devastated by the malignant wind. His departure from that city, described later as divine calling, aligns chronologically with its decline. In this context, the call to leave becomes less mystical and more urgent. Stay and perish, or go and survive. Abraham's God is not Marduk. His God does not reside in Babylonian temples or accept a place in the new pantheon. This God demands exclusivity, something unusual in a world accustomed to layered worship. The insistence on no other gods makes sense only if other gods are seen not as false, but as rivals. Monotheism, in this light, is not philosophical minimalism. It is political refusal. The covenant Abraham enters into is territorial and generational. Land is promised, descendants assured. Protection is conditional upon loyalty. These are the terms of a pact, not an abstract belief system. The language mirrors older agreements between gods and kings, but with a crucial inversion. The god binds himself to a people rather than a city or empire. This small, mobile group carries a memory that runs counter to Babylonian theology. In their stories, the god who judges with fire is not the architect of cosmic order, but a moral arbiter who destroys cities selectively. The emphasis is not on hierarchy, but on behavior and allegiance. These narratives preserve details, Babylonian myth reframes, warning before destruction, escape instructions, aftermath that poisons land rather than renews it. Over time, these parallel memories harden into competing worldviews. One celebrates centralized power as salvation from chaos. The other distrusts empires and emphasizes covenant, law, and separation. Both trace their authority back to the same catastrophic era, but they draw opposite conclusions. What unites them is the scar. Neither side forgets the fire. Whether described as divine victory or divine judgment, it remains the axis around which belief turns. Even centuries later, when the technical cause is lost to time, the emotional imprint remains intact. History tends to favor the victor's narrative, but geology is impartial. The land near the Dead Sea remains barren, regardless of which god is praised. Salt still crusts the soil. Ruins remain silent. Empires rise elsewhere, but the plain stays empty, a physical contradiction to stories of renewal. As Babylon flourishes, it does so atop inherited knowledge and displaced populations. Its dominance feels inevitable in hindsight, but it is built on the absence left by disaster. Power flows toward stability, the way water flows downhill. The catastrophe did not choose Babylon as ruler, it merely removed its rivals. In the long arc of memory, this moment marks a turning point. The gods retreat from direct intervention. Stories replace presence. Law replaces command. Humanity inherits a world reshaped by forces it did not control, guided by narratives designed to make sense of trauma. Yet beneath those narratives lies a simpler truth. Immense power was used, and it worked. Cities were erased, opponents were neutralized, authority was consolidated. The cost was ecological ruin and cultural fracture, but the objective was achieved. That lesson, once learned, never fully disappears. It waits beneath civilization, dormant but remembered, ready to surface whenever power once again believes destruction can bring order. With Babylon ascendant and the old centers of power reduced to ghosts, the gods who once walked openly among humans began to change their methods. Presence gave way to distance. Direct command became mediated through signs, laws, and intermediaries. This shift was not sudden, but it was decisive. After the fire, the world could no longer tolerate proximity to its architects. The retreat of the older gods did not mean disappearance. It meant containment. They withdrew into roles that required less exposure and less risk. Sacred spaces replaced shared spaces. Mountains, deserts, and sealed sanctuaries became the new points of contact. In ancient imagination, these locations were holy not because they were peaceful, but because they were dangerous. Approach required preparation. Boundaries mattered. The Sinai Peninsula embodies this transformation with unusual clarity. Long before it became central to later religious tradition, It was already marked as a place of awe and exclusion. Descriptions emphasize fire, smoke, trembling ground, and strict prohibitions against approach. The language mirrors the aftermath zones of catastrophic events, places where lingering danger persists long after the initial impact. Such zones demand rules not out of reverence, but survival. When later narratives describe a god descending upon a mountain in fire and cloud, the imagery aligns seamlessly with this memory. The mountain is not climbed casually, it is cordoned off. Those who cross the boundary die. The god's voice is thunderous, overwhelming, and terrifying. This is not the intimacy of a shepherd deity, it is the controlled interface with overwhelming force. The law delivered in this context reflects that same caution. It is not a poetic meditation, but a rigid structure of do's and don'ts, consequences clearly outlined. Law becomes a buffer between humanity and power. Follow the instructions and survive. Deviate and face annihilation. The memory of earlier destruction has taught restraint the hard way. Meanwhile, Babylon's theology adapts to this new distance elegantly. Marduk does not need to appear. His authority is embedded in ritual order, celestial movements, and kingship. The stars themselves become his script. By controlling calendars and omens, Babylonian priests maintain influence without invoking fire. This is power refined, institutionalized, and safe. Other traditions respond differently. Some reject celestial intermediaries entirely, forbidding images and representations. Their god cannot be seen, named fully, or localized. This abstraction is not philosophical minimalism, it is defensive design. A god without form cannot be weaponized easily. A god without a city cannot be captured. After witnessing what happens when divine power becomes territorial, such traditions choose mobility and invisibility. This divergence shapes human history profoundly. Empires favor gods who legitimize hierarchy and expansion. Smaller groups favor gods who travel, who bind themselves to people rather than places. Both are survival strategies forged in the shadow of catastrophe. As centuries pass, the technical memory of what caused the destruction fades, but behavioral memory persists. People learn to fear the wrong signs: sudden light, unnatural wind, poisoned ground. They encode these fears into stories and taboos. Certain valleys become cursed. Certain mountains become forbidden. Certain times are marked as unlucky. These are not arbitrary superstitions. They are fragments of risk assessment passed down without explanation. The archaeological record confirms this behavioral shift. After the Middle Bronze Age collapse in regions affected by the event, settlement patterns change. Populations concentrate in safer zones, avoid low basins, and prioritize access to clean water sources. Urban density decreases. Defensive architecture becomes more common. Societies grow cautious, less expansive, more controlled. This caution is reflected in literature as well. Earlier epics celebrate gods who destroy freely. Later texts emphasize restraint, covenant, and obedience. The tone shifts from heroic chaos to regulated order. Humanity, having survived near extinction, chooses predictability over brilliance. Even the gods are constrained by this new reality. In Sumerian laments, divine figures express regret and helplessness in the face of the evil wind. This is unprecedented. Gods who once commanded nature now suffer from its consequences. They are no longer immune. This realization forces a re-evaluation of power itself. The concept of fate gains prominence here. If even gods cannot fully control outcomes once certain forces are unleashed, then wisdom lies in prevention rather than domination. Law, ritual, and taboo become the tools of restraint. Technology, once openly wielded, is buried beneath myth, yet traces remain. Descriptions of divine weapons persist in coded language: thunderbolts, flaming swords, chariots of fire. These are not fantasies born of ignorance. They are metaphors chosen to describe phenomena too dangerous to describe plainly. Over time, metaphor becomes belief, and belief becomes doctrine. The human role in this transformed world becomes more complex. No longer merely workers or worshippers, humans become custodians of memory. They carry stories that warn against excess. They preserve lessons learned at catastrophic cost. Even when those lessons are misinterpreted, they continue to shape behavior. The land itself reinforces these lessons relentlessly. The Dead Sea remains lifeless. Southern Mesopotamia never fully recovers its former dominance. These are not moral punishments, but physical consequences. Civilizations built elsewhere thrive because they adapt, not because they are favored. In this long aftermath, the idea of progress becomes cautious. Advancement is balanced against fear of repeating the past. Innovation slows. Experimentation becomes localized. The world enters a period of consolidation rather than expansion. This is often labeled stagnation by modern standards, but from another perspective, it is recovery. Power, once centralized through destruction, now disperses slowly through law and culture. The gods recede into symbolism. Kings rule by mandate rather than presence. Humanity inherits a quieter world, one shaped by restraint. But silence does not erase memory. Beneath ritual and scripture lies an unspoken understanding. There are forces that should not be awakened. There are thresholds that must not be crossed. The sky once burned. The earth once died. Survival now depends on remembering without repeating. This is the legacy of the fire. Not a single religion or empire, but a global instinct toward caution. An awareness that knowledge without restraint invites ruin. The ancient world learned this lesson through annihilation. Its descendants carry it forward as fear, law, and reverence, never fully knowing why, only knowing that forgetting would be worse. As the generations born after the catastrophe grew old, the world they inherited was already shaped by absence. Children learned geography defined by places no one entered and valleys no one claimed. Silence became part of the landscape, not because people forgot what happened, but because remembering too clearly offered no protection. The destruction had rewritten instinct itself. In the southern Jordan Valley, the ruins of once dominant cities lay exposed to wind and sun. There was no effort to rebuild over them. Later, cultures did not stack new settlements atop the old, as they commonly did elsewhere. Instead, they left the scars open, allowing erosion to erase walls slowly rather than reclaim them. This was an unusual choice in an ancient world that reused stone relentlessly. Here, abandonment was deliberate. The same pattern appears in southern Mesopotamia. After the decline of Sumer, rebuilding occurred unevenly. Some cities were reoccupied cautiously, others left untouched. Irrigation systems were simplified or relocated. Large-scale agricultural ambition gave way to smaller, more controlled efforts. The land itself had proven capable of turning against its inhabitants, and trust was not easily restored. Memory adapted to this new reality. What had once been technical became symbolic. Fire from the sky was no longer described in operational terms, but as divine anger. Winds that carried death became curses. Poisoned land became evidence of moral failure. This reframing did not distort the event. It translated it into a form that could be transmitted without paralyzing fear. Ritual emerged as a coping mechanism. Societies developed ways to symbolically reenact catastrophe in controlled forms. Sacrificial fire burned in contained spaces. Smoke rose in predictable columns. Salt was used in purification rites, paradoxically transforming a symbol of death into one of cleansing. These practices allowed people to approach the memory without being consumed by it. Time itself became structured around caution. Calendars marked dangerous periods, inauspicious days when travel or construction was forbidden. Celestial events were watched obsessively, not out of curiosity but vigilance. An eclipse was not beautiful, it was threatening. The sky had betrayed humanity once. It might do so again. This vigilance influenced governance. Kings were judged not only by conquest or wealth, but by their ability to prevent disaster. A reign marked by famine, plague, or unusual natural phenomena was seen as failed, regardless of military success. Authority existed to maintain equilibrium, not expand endlessly. The ideal ruler was one who kept the world stable. Religious language reinforced this expectation. Gods were invoked as guardians rather than warriors. Appeals focused on mercy, restraint, and protection from chaos. The memory of annihilation had shifted the desired relationship with power. Humanity no longer sought dominance, it sought insulation. Yet beneath this caution, ambition never vanished. It merely changed shape. Instead of open displays of overwhelming force, power became indirect. Influence was exercised through law, culture, and economics. The world grew more subtle, not more peaceful. Conflict persisted, but its tools were chosen with an eye toward containment. This is visible in how wars were remembered. Battles fought with conventional means were celebrated and recorded. Total destruction was avoided or reframed as mythic anomaly. No ruler wanted to be associated with land rendered useless forever. Victory that left nothing to govern was no victory at all. The ancient catastrophe thus established an unspoken boundary. There were acceptable forms of violence and unacceptable ones. The line was not moral in the abstract, it was ecological and existential. Destroying an enemy was permissible. Destroying the ground itself was not. This boundary echoes forward into later ethical systems. Concepts like just war, proportional response, and forbidden weapons have deep roots. Long before philosophers articulated them, societies felt them. They were learned through loss, not theory. Stories preserved this boundary with remarkable consistency. Weapons of ultimate power appear rarely in myth, and when they do, their use is final and tragic. Heroes who wield them often withdraw or perish afterward. The narrative message is clear. Such power ends stories rather than continuing them. Even the gods learn restraint in these traditions. After initial eras of chaos and destruction, divine beings swear oaths, establish laws, and limit their own actions. Cosmic order replaces divine impulse. This is not theology evolving toward abstraction. It is trauma crystallizing into structure. As centuries pass, the original event becomes unrecognizable in detail, but unmistakable in effect. Societies no longer know what happened, but they know what must not happen again. This is how deep memory operates. It does not preserve images, It preserves rules. The land itself enforces those rules. Attempts to resettle the poisoned zones fail repeatedly. Crops wither. Water remains bitter. Even when technology improves, success remains limited. Nature becomes the final authority, indifferent to belief or intention. Travelers record the desolation with unease. Writers describe the Dead Sea as unnatural, a place where nothing lives, where the air feels heavy. Such descriptions are consistent across eras, suggesting a sustained impression that defies explanation. People sense that something fundamental is wrong there. This sensory unease reinforces myth. The land appears cursed because it behaves differently. Science later offers partial explanations, but the feeling precedes understanding. Human perception often recognizes danger before language catches up. As memory fragments further, different cultures interpret the catastrophe through their own lenses. Some see it as divine justice, others as the end of a previous age, others as a warning left by ancestors. None are entirely wrong, because each captures a facet of the truth. What unites them is the acknowledgement of finality. The ancient destruction was not cyclical. It was not followed by renewal in the same place. It marked an end, not a transition. This distinguishes it from floods, earthquakes, or wars, which rebuild eventually. Here, rebuilding did not come. That absence shapes identity. Civilizations define themselves partly by where they choose not to live. Forbidden places anchor cultural boundaries as much as capitals do. The dead zones become negative monuments, reminding humanity of limits without words. In this way, the catastrophe continues to function. It governs behavior long after its origin is lost. It whispers caution into ambition. It tempers innovation with fear. It teaches that some forces, once released, erase the future they were meant to secure. The ancient world absorbed this lesson through suffering. The modern world inherits it through story. Whether that inheritance will be honored or ignored remains uncertain. But the warning endures, etched into land that refuses to forget. As memory continued to erode into tradition, the catastrophe gradually stopped being treated as a single event and instead became a boundary between ages. Time itself fractured around it. What came before was described as a world closer to the gods, more dangerous, more fluid. What came after was smaller, quieter, constrained by rules that no one remembered choosing. Humanity did not simply survive the fire, it adapted to a reduced horizon. The generations that followed inherited a strange contradiction. They possessed advanced remnants of earlier knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, yet they approached innovation with restraint. Tools improved, but ambition narrowed. The world felt finite now. Certain doors, once opened, had clearly led somewhere humanity could not afford to return. This shift is visible in how cities were planned. Urban centers grew denser rather than broader. Walls thickened. Zoning emerged between sacred, administrative, and residential spaces. Fire was confined to hearths and kilns, regulated and supervised. Large-scale uncontrolled combustion became rare and feared. Even festivals involving flame emphasized containment, symmetry, and ritual order. Language adapted as well. Words associated with light and heat acquired double meanings. Illumination became synonymous with revelation, but also with danger. Purity and destruction shared vocabulary. This linguistic overlap reveals unresolved tension. Fire was both tool and threat, benefactor and executioner. In literature, heroes became less godlike. Early epics celebrated figures who reshaped landscapes. Later stories favored endurance, cleverness, and survival. Victory was defined not by annihilation of enemies, but by preservation of community. This narrative evolution mirrors ecological reality. After witnessing land rendered unusable, survival became the highest achievement. The divine sphere followed suit. Gods grew more distant, less impulsive. Their actions were framed as slow, deliberate, and mediated through law. Sudden interventions became rare and terrifying exceptions. Divine wrath, when described, was postponed to the end of time, safely removed from daily expectation. The apocalypse was delayed indefinitely. This delay served an important psychological function. By pushing ultimate destruction into a distant future, societies could function without constant dread. The ancient fire became something that happened once, long ago, under extraordinary circumstances. Daily life could resume under the assumption of stability, even if that stability was fragile. Yet anxiety never disappeared entirely. It settled into the background, shaping values quietly. Humility became virtue. Pride became sin. Excess was condemned. These moral frameworks did not emerge in a vacuum. They were cultural technologies designed to prevent escalation toward irreversible outcomes. When empires expanded again, they did so cautiously at first. Assyria, later Persia, developed vast administrative systems to manage diversity rather than obliterate it. Conquest was followed by integration, not scorched earth. Empires learned that ruling ruins offered no advantage. Destruction had to be reversible. This restraint is especially notable given the military capabilities of later civilizations. Siege engines improved, weapons grew deadlier, yet total annihilation remained rare and shocking. When it occurred, it was remembered as atrocity, not triumph. The memory of absolute destruction had established a moral ceiling on violence. Trade flourished within these limits. Exchange replaced domination as the primary mode of expansion. Goods, ideas, and technologies traveled farther than armies. This diffusion allowed civilization to grow without concentrating power dangerously. Diversity became a form of insurance. Religious systems reinforced this balance. Most pantheons stabilized, with clear hierarchies and domains. Gods of war were balanced by gods of fertility, justice, and healing. No single deity was allowed to embody unchecked force. Even supreme gods were constrained by fate, law, or cosmic order. The concept of covenant emerges strongly in this context. Agreements between gods and humans, between rulers and subjects, between communities themselves, become sacred. Breaking covenants invites disaster. This is not mere moralism. It reflects understanding that trust is the foundation of stability, and betrayal escalates toward chaos. The catastrophe thus becomes embedded not as a story of punishment, but as a lesson about limits. Power requires structure. Knowledge requires ethics. Fire requires containment. These principles permeate education, ritual, and governance, even when their origin is forgotten. Occasionally, however, the old fascination resurfaces. Mystics, alchemists, and later philosophers seek lost knowledge, believing the ancients possessed secrets that could elevate humanity again. These pursuits are often marginal, viewed with suspicion. Those who seek too much are labeled heretics or madmen. Society protects itself by marginalizing curiosity that threatens stability. Still, fragments of ancient knowledge survive in unexpected places. Astronomical records preserve astonishing precision. Mathematical systems appear fully formed. Myths hint at machines, flights, and weapons beyond historical capability. These anomalies are explained away as metaphor, but their persistence suggests inheritance rather than invention. The land itself continues to anchor these abstractions. Dead zones remain dead. Fertile regions recover only partially. The environment remembers longer than culture. Even when political systems change, ecological scars persist, enforcing humility across generations. This environmental memory acts as an external conscience. It prevents mythology from drifting too far from reality. No matter how benevolent a god is described, the land beneath his supposed miracles may tell another story. Salt does not lie. Glassed stone does not forget. As humanity advances technologically in later eras, the ancient pattern reasserts itself. New forms of concentrated power emerge. Again, there is confidence. Again, there is belief in control. And again, old stories gain relevance. Fire from heaven stops being myth and becomes possibility. The ancient catastrophe thus serves as a mirror. It reflects humanity's recurring tendency to overestimate mastery and underestimate consequence. Each age believes itself wiser than the last. Each inherits warnings encoded as legend rather than instruction. What distinguishes survival from repetition is not knowledge alone, but memory applied with humility. The ancient world lacked the language to explain what it witnessed, but it learned restraint through suffering. The modern world possesses the language, but risks losing the restraint. The fire that once erased cities did more than destroy structures. It reshaped values, behaviors, and the very definition of progress. Civilization continued not because the catastrophe was forgotten, but because it was transformed into boundaries no one dared openly challenge. Those boundaries still exist, invisible but firm, etched into culture and earth alike. Whether they will hold under renewed pressure remains an open outcome, but the lesson itself is clear. When power exceeds wisdom, the world does not bend. It breaks. As centuries layered themselves over the ruins, the catastrophe gradually stopped being remembered as an external act and began to be internalized as a flaw within humanity itself. What once had been attributed to gods, stars, or cosmic forces was slowly reframed as a warning about human behavior. This shift was subtle but profound. Responsibility moved inward, even as the true mechanism faded from view. Law became the primary vessel for this internalization. Early legal systems are filled with disproportionate penalties, reflecting an anxiety that small deviations could spiral into existential threat. Theft, blasphemy, and disobedience were punished harshly, not because they were common, but because order itself felt fragile. The memory of total collapse lingered like a fever dream, teaching societies that chaos did not need encouragement. Writing reinforced this mindset. Chronicles no longer glorified annihilation. They emphasized continuity, lineage, and preservation. Kings boasted not of how many cities they destroyed, but of how long their reigns lasted without disaster. Stability became the highest achievement. Survival itself was success. Religious narratives adapted accordingly. Instead of gods wielding overtly destructive power, emphasis shifted to commandments, covenants, and gradual judgment. Divine wrath became conditional and delayed, giving humanity room to correct course. The apocalypse was no longer imminent. It was postponed, contingent on failure. This allowed daily life to proceed without paralyzing fear. Yet traces of the original terror remained embedded in ritual language. Phrases invoking fire, smoke, and wind persisted, stripped of immediacy, but not of weight. Prayers asked for protection from sudden destruction, from unseen forces, from disasters without warning. These invocations were not poetic excess. They were cultural muscle memory. Education played a role in shaping this restraint. Apprenticeship replaced revelation. Knowledge was transmitted slowly, incrementally, and often guarded by guilds or priesthoods. Dangerous information was restricted. Secrets were layered, revealed only after years of discipline. This structure was not elitism alone. It was containment. Architecture echoed this philosophy. Monumental structures returned, but with careful engineering. Stone replaced mud brick. Redundancy was built into design. Temples and palaces emphasized permanence over height. The goal was to endure, not to impress the heavens. Even sacred spaces were grounded. As trade networks expanded, cultural exchange spread these values beyond their place of origin. Civilizations that had never witnessed the original catastrophe adopted similar caution, inheriting taboos without context. Sacred mountains appeared worldwide. Forbidden zones emerged independently. Humanity converged on restraint through shared fear, even when the cause was forgotten. This convergence suggests that the lesson embedded in the catastrophe resonated universally. It addressed a fundamental vulnerability: the mismatch between power and foresight. When a species gains the ability to alter its environment faster than it can understand consequences, disaster follows. The ancient world learned this lesson brutally. Over time, this understanding crystallized into philosophy. Thinkers began to question the nature of hubris, the limits of knowledge, and the ethics of power. Greek tragedies, for example, revolve around characters who exceed bounds and are destroyed not by malice, but by inevitability. The gods in these stories are less villains than embodiments of consequence. In parallel, scientific curiosity emerged cautiously. Observation replaced speculation. Empiricism grew slowly, bounded by reverence for natural order. The world was no longer something to be dominated, but something to be understood incrementally. The idea that nature could punish arrogance became foundational. Yet this caution always competed with ambition. Empires still rose, wars still occurred. But the threshold of acceptable destruction remained constrained. Total erasure was rare and condemned. Even conquerors understood that a scorched world could not sustain victory. The memory of poisoned land reinforced this. Regions rendered infertile by disaster served as living examples of what excess yields. These landscapes were avoided, mythologized, and feared. They became geographic warnings, teaching lessons without words. As writing systems evolved, historians struggled with gaps. Sudden collapses, abandoned cities, and unexplained migrations puzzled scholars. Lacking technical explanations, they turned to moral ones. Societies must have angered their gods. People must have sinned. These explanations preserved the warning even as accuracy suffered. This moralization had consequences. It shifted blame from systems to individuals, from power structures to personal failings. While this allowed societies to function without confronting uncontrollable forces, it also obscured the real danger: the misuse of overwhelming capability. Despite this distortion, the core lesson persisted. Limits matter. Boundaries exist for survival. When crossed, no justification prevents consequence. This truth seeped into proverbs, laws, and customs across civilizations. The catastrophe thus became a silent architect of human psychology. It fostered caution, respect for limits, and fear of sudden change. It also bred denial. By turning disaster into moral allegory, humanity distanced itself from the uncomfortable possibility that it could happen again through means not yet understood. This denial is visible in cycles of confidence. Periods of stability breed belief in mastery. Warnings are dismissed as archaic superstition. Old stories are reinterpreted as metaphor. Then power accumulates again, and the same thresholds approach. What distinguishes later eras from the ancient one is not immunity, but awareness. The warnings exist, encoded in culture, ready to be recalled. Whether they are heeded depends on humility, not intelligence. The ancient catastrophe reshaped civilization not by ending it, but by teaching it to fear itself. That fear, translated into ethics, law, and restraint, allowed humanity to persist. It remains one of the most effective survival mechanisms ever developed. Yet fear fades. Memory thins. New generations inherit the benefits of restraint without remembering its cost. The land still remembers, but people grow distant from its lessons. The silence of ruined valleys and barren plains continues to speak, but only to those willing to listen. The story they tell is not about gods or punishment. It is about limits crossed and consequences endured. In this way, the catastrophe never truly ended. It became part of humanity's operating system, shaping choices invisibly. Whether it will remain so, or be overwritten by renewed arrogance, is not foretold. What is certain is that the lesson remains, etched into history, waiting to be either remembered or repeated. As the long shadow of the catastrophe stretched into later centuries, its influence began to surface in an unexpected place: the way humanity imagined the future. Early societies did not think linearly. Time was cyclical, repeating seasons, repeating ages. After the destruction, that confidence fractured. The future was no longer assumed to resemble the past. It became conditional. This change is visible in prophetic traditions that emerge across cultures. Predictions of collapse, fire, and judgment appear not as distant fantasies, but as ever-present possibilities. The end of the world is no longer an abstract idea. It is something that has already happened once, at least in part. The future is haunted by precedent. Apocalyptic language carries specific sensory markers inherited from the ancient event. Light that overwhelms vision, heat that arrives instantly, winds that carry sickness, darkness following brightness. These motifs recur with remarkable consistency, suggesting that they are not invented for dramatic effect, but remembered impressions reshaped into warning. Crucially, these traditions do not describe slow decay. They describe sudden transition. One moment the world functions, the next it does not. This expectation conditions behavior. Societies prepare not only for famine or war, but for abrupt discontinuity. The idea that everything can change at once becomes psychologically normalized. This normalization affects ethics. If the world can end suddenly, then behavior must be regulated continuously. Moral systems emphasize vigilance rather than repentance after the fact. Obedience becomes preventive maintenance. Law becomes a stabilizing technology meant to delay catastrophe, not merely punish wrongdoing. In this environment, knowledge becomes morally weighted. Not all understanding is considered beneficial. Certain forms of inquiry are restricted. framed as dangerous or forbidden. Myths of lost wisdom, sealed books, and hidden names proliferate. These are not anti-intellectual impulses. They are attempts to manage risk by controlling access. The figure of the forbidden teacher appears repeatedly, one who reveals too much, too fast, and is punished for it. This figure is often sympathetic, but tragic. His failure reinforces the lesson that premature knowledge invites destruction. Progress must be gradual or not at all. Science, when it eventually emerges in recognizable form, carries this inheritance quietly. Early natural philosophers framed their work as uncovering divine order, not reshaping reality. Observation is valued over manipulation. Understanding is separated from application. This distinction persists far longer than commonly acknowledged. Political power adapts similarly. Authority is justified not by innovation, but by continuity. Rulers claim legitimacy through ancestry, tradition, and preservation of order. Radical change is viewed with suspicion. Revolutions are rare and traumatic. Stability is prized above improvement. When revolutions do occur, they are often framed as restorations of an original balance rather than new beginnings. Even upheaval seeks legitimacy in the past. This backward-looking orientation reflects deep discomfort with untested futures. The memory of annihilation also shapes humanity's relationship with the environment. Nature is no longer merely a resource, it is a potential adversary. Floods, droughts, and storms are interpreted as signs of imbalance. Human activity is scrutinized for its effect on cosmic order. Environmental ethics emerge not from sentimentality, but from fear. Sacred groves, protected rivers, and taboo landscapes proliferate. These restrictions function as early conservation, limiting exploitation. The justification is religious, but the effect is practical. Land that is left alone recovers. Resources last longer. Survival improves. Even warfare internalizes these limits. Ritualized combat, codes of honor, and rules of engagement develop. While often violated, their existence indicates aspiration toward controlled violence. Total war remains an aberration, feared even by those who practice it. The ancient catastrophe thus acts as a negative blueprint. It defines what must be avoided. Everything else organizes itself around that absence. Societies innovate within constraints shaped by memory of excess. Over time, this memory becomes increasingly abstract. The original cities are forgotten. The land remains barren, but explanations drift. The catastrophe is attributed to gods, demons, or moral failure. Yet the behavioral outcome remains consistent: restraint. When new technologies appear, they are integrated cautiously. Iron replaces bronze gradually. Writing spreads slowly. Each advancement is tested socially before becoming widespread. Acceleration is distrusted. This distrust is not uniform. Some cultures push boundaries more aggressively. When they do, resistance emerges from within and without. Stories warn of overreach. Elders caution against arrogance. The language may differ, but the message is ancient. Eventually, humanity reaches a point where technological capability begins to echo the scale of the original catastrophe. Energy concentration increases, distance collapses, speed accelerates. The old metaphors suddenly feel literal again. At this stage, ancient stories are reinterpreted. Fire from heaven becomes allegory for weapons. Poisoned winds resemble fallout. Salted lands resemble contamination. What once seemed symbolic now reads as descriptive. The past becomes uncomfortably relevant. This realization produces tension. On one hand, humanity prides itself on progress and rationality. On the other, it recognizes patterns it has seen before, recorded by people who lacked modern language but not modern fear. The old warnings refuse to stay buried. The catastrophe thus transcends its historical moment. It becomes a reference point for evaluating risk. When decisions involve irreversible consequences, echoes of the ancient fire resurface. Phrases like "point of no return" capture this intuition. The question humanity grapples with is not whether it can avoid repeating the past, but whether it will recognize it in time. The ancient world learned through annihilation. The modern world has the option to learn through memory. That memory, however, is fragmented. It exists in stories, ruins, taboos, and instincts rather than manuals. It requires interpretation. It demands humility. It resists certainty. What remains constant is the structure of the lesson. Concentrated power without restraint produces outcomes beyond control. Once released, such forces reshape the world regardless of intent. Survival depends not on mastery, but on refusal. The ancient catastrophe embedded this refusal into civilization's foundations. It shaped law, religion, ethics, and fear. It taught humanity to build walls not only of stone, but of custom and conscience. Whether those walls will endure under modern pressure remains unresolved. History offers no guarantees. It offers only precedent. The fire that once fell did not end the world, but it ended innocence. Everything that followed grew in its shadow, negotiating with memory whether acknowledged or not. The future, like the past, will be shaped by how seriously that shadow is taken. As humanity continued forward, the ancient catastrophe began to function less as memory and more as inheritance. No one alive could recall the fire, the poisoned wind, or the sudden erasure of cities. Yet decisions were still being made, as if those experiences lingered just beyond recall. This is how deep trauma survives, not as story, but as instinct encoded into civilization itself. Institutions hardened around this instinct. Councils, senates, priesthoods, and later academies arose not merely to govern people, but to slow momentum. Decision-making became collective. Authority fractured into checks and balances. Even kings, once absolute, found themselves bound by custom, law, and ritual. Concentrated power had proven too dangerous to leave unchecked. This structural caution appears clearly in how societies treated escalation. Small conflicts were tolerated, large ones were feared. Leaders learned to justify war carefully, to frame it as defensive, necessary, limited. The language of inevitability replaced the language of ambition. Violence became bureaucratic, constrained by procedure, precisely because uncontrolled force had once destroyed everything. Technology followed the same path. Innovations that promised efficiency were welcomed. Those that threatened disruption were delayed, debated, or suppressed. Progress became incremental by design. This was not stagnation, but survival strategy. Humanity learned that speed magnifies error. Education reinforced this approach. Knowledge was tiered. Basic skills were universal. Advanced understanding was restricted. Apprenticeship systems ensured that power was paired with discipline. Mastery required patience. Impulsiveness was punished. The lesson was clear. Capability without maturity invites catastrophe. This principle extended into morality. Virtues such as temperance, humility, and obedience gained prominence across cultures. Pride became a cardinal vice. Overreach was condemned not because it was immoral in theory, but because it was dangerous in practice. Ethics evolved as damage control. Mythology adapted to reinforce these values. Stories warned against flying too close to the sun, against stealing fire from the gods, against opening sealed boxes. These narratives differed in detail, but converged in message. There are boundaries for a reason. Crossing them ends stories. The figure of the trickster, once celebrated, becomes ambivalent. Cleverness remains admired, but only when it operates within limits. Tricksters who disrupt cosmic order are punished. Intelligence is acceptable. Destabilization is not. Over time, the ancient catastrophe also shaped how humanity defined success. Greatness became endurance rather than transformation. Civilizations measured achievement in centuries, not moments. Longevity became proof of wisdom. Anything that burned brightly and briefly was suspect. This redefinition influenced art and architecture. Permanence was valued over spectacle. Stone replaced fragile materials. Proportions emphasized stability. Even monumental projects aimed to endure rather than astonish. The memory of sudden ruin haunted design choices. Religion, too, absorbed this orientation. The divine became associated with law, continuity, and covenant rather than raw power. Miracles grew rare. Revelation slowed. Gods spoke through tradition instead of fire. The sacred was domesticated enough to be survivable. Yet beneath this restraint, tension persisted. Humanity never stopped wondering what had been lost. Ancient texts hinted at greater knowledge, greater reach, greater unity between heaven and earth. The idea that the past had been more advanced lingered uncomfortably alongside fear of repeating it. This tension fueled cycles of rediscovery. Periodically, societies uncovered fragments of old understanding and felt a surge of confidence. Each surge was followed by backlash, reform, or collapse. Progress advanced in waves, not lines, each crest tempered by inherited caution. The ancient catastrophe thus acted as a regulator across millennia. It did not halt development. It shaped its rhythm. Advance, pause, consolidate. Push, retreat, remember. Civilization learned to breathe. As humanity expanded geographically, this pattern traveled with it. New lands were settled with myths already in place. Taboos preceded experience. People feared repeating disasters they had never witnessed. This preemptive fear prevented some mistakes and delayed others. The environment reinforced these lessons relentlessly. Regions damaged by ancient events never fully recovered. They stood as permanent counter-arguments to hubris. No philosophy could make dead land fertile again. Reality remained stubborn. When later societies encountered new forms of concentrated power, the old instincts reactivated. Debates erupted about limits, responsibility, and consequence. Language changed, but the structure of concern remained identical to ancient councils arguing over unleashing destructive forces. The catastrophe also reshaped humanity's sense of agency. People learned that not all outcomes could be controlled or reversed. This fostered fatalism in some cultures and responsibility in others. Either way, the illusion of total mastery was broken early. This break is perhaps the most important legacy. Once humanity learned that the world could be irreparably damaged, innocence was lost permanently. Every decision thereafter carried implicit risk assessment. Even optimism was cautious. As time moved on, memory thinned further. The original event became almost unrecognizable beneath layers of reinterpretation. Yet its influence remained measurable in what societies refused to do. Certain thresholds were avoided instinctively, even when no rational explanation was offered. This avoidance is not proof of wisdom, but of learning through pain. The ancient world paid the price so future generations would hesitate. That hesitation, fragile and often ignored, is still humanity's most reliable defense. The catastrophe that erased cities did not end civilization. It forced civilization to grow up. It replaced naive confidence with conditional hope. It taught humanity that survival depends not on power alone, but on restraint enforced over time. That lesson continues to operate silently, shaping choices long after its origin has faded. Whether it will continue to do so in the face of accelerating change is uncertain, but its presence is undeniable. The ancient fire may no longer burn in the sky, but it burns in the architecture of civilization itself, a hidden framework reminding humanity that some victories cost the future, and some limits exist not to be challenged, but to be respected. As centuries accumulated, and the original disaster slipped beyond even distorted myth, humanity entered a phase where the danger was no longer the memory of destruction, but the absence of it. The land still bore scars, yet people born far from them felt insulated from consequence. What had once been a lived boundary slowly became an abstract concept, easier to reinterpret than to respect. Civilization at this stage appeared stable, even confident. Empires rose with sophisticated administration, trade networks spanned continents, and systems of law projected permanence. This outward solidity masked an internal shift. The structures built to prevent catastrophic escalation still existed, but they were no longer understood as safeguards. They were seen as traditions, bureaucratic habits, or cultural quirks whose original purpose had been forgotten. This forgetting altered how risk was perceived. Earlier societies had treated certain actions as inherently dangerous, even if they could not fully explain why. Later societies demanded justification for caution. If harm could not be demonstrated immediately, restraint felt unnecessary. The burden of proof shifted from action to prevention, weakening protective instincts that had once been automatic. Knowledge, once filtered carefully through layers of initiation, became increasingly accessible. Literacy expanded. Records multiplied. Information circulated faster than ever before. This expansion empowered individuals but diluted accountability. When knowledge was scarce, its misuse was traceable. When it became abundant, responsibility fragmented. Innovation accelerated under these conditions. Techniques that once would have been tested for generations were implemented rapidly. Systems were optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. Redundancy, once valued as protection, was labeled waste. This change did not arise from recklessness alone, but from confidence born of uninterrupted success. The environment responded quietly at first. Subtle imbalances appeared. Soils degraded, water systems strained, ecosystems simplified. These changes were slow enough to dismiss, distributed enough to ignore. No single event echoed the ancient fire, so no alarm sounded loudly enough to halt momentum. Culturally, this era reframed the past. Ancient ruins were admired aesthetically rather than feared. They became symbols of mystery and achievement, stripped of their cautionary weight. The narrative shifted from, "This place was destroyed," to, "This place was great." Loss was romanticized. Catastrophe became backdrop. Religion and philosophy adapted to this optimism. Divine judgment softened further, becoming moral rather than material. Consequences were internalized as guilt or virtue instead of environmental or systemic collapse. This shift reduced existential anxiety, but also detached ethics from physical reality. Political systems reflected the same trend. Long-term stability encouraged short-term thinking. Leaders planned within election cycles, reigns, or lifetimes, rarely across centuries. Decisions optimized immediate benefit while externalizing future cost. This temporal compression made irreversible outcomes difficult to perceive until they were unavoidable. Despite this, remnants of ancient caution persisted in subtle ways. Certain technologies provoked instinctive discomfort. Large-scale changes inspired unease disproportionate to their immediate effects. Public debates echoed old arguments about hubris and restraint, though often without historical grounding. The instinct remained, even when its origin was unknown. This tension produced cycles of enthusiasm and backlash. Periods of rapid advancement were followed by calls for regulation, ethics, or reform. These responses mirrored ancient attempts to contain dangerous power, translated into modern language. Each cycle revealed the same struggle: how to benefit from capability without triggering irreversible harm. The difference now lay in scale and speed. Ancient catastrophes unfolded over days or weeks. Modern systems can destabilize globally in moments. Feedback loops operate faster than human institutions can respond. The margin for correction has narrowed dramatically. The ancient catastrophe had taught that once certain thresholds are crossed, control is lost. Later societies, lacking visceral memory, treated thresholds as negotiable. Models replaced instinct. Probability replaced fear. Risk became acceptable if statistically unlikely, even if consequences were total. This rationalization ignored a crucial lesson from the past. Low probability does not equal low impact. The ancient world did not expect annihilation either. Its disaster was unexpected precisely because it lay outside normal experience. Modern reliance on prediction risks repeating that blind spot. The scars of the ancient event still resist erasure. Regions remain barren. Environmental anomalies persist. These are not symbolic. They are physical limits imposed by history. No ideology has reversed them. No narrative has healed them. They stand as proof that some actions permanently reduce possibility. Yet such proof requires interpretation, and interpretation requires willingness. As distance from the event increased, fewer people felt compelled to connect present choices with ancient outcomes. The past became separate, irrelevant, or quaint. Its lessons required translation to remain effective, and translation lagged behind change. This lag created vulnerability. Humanity advanced faster than its cultural immune system could adapt. Safeguards designed for slower eras strained under accelerated conditions. Ethical frameworks struggled to keep pace with capability. Responsibility diffused across systems too complex to assign blame clearly. In this environment, denial became adaptive. Acknowledging systemic risk would demand profound change. It would require slowing down, sacrificing growth, and recentering restraint. Such changes threatened existing power structures, making denial politically and psychologically attractive. The ancient catastrophe had faced similar denial. Warnings were given, dismissed, and overridden by urgency. The decisive action intended to secure order instead destroyed it. This pattern does not depend on era or technology. It depends on human behavior under pressure. What distinguishes the later era is awareness without conviction. Information exists. Data accumulates. Warnings are articulated clearly. Yet action lags because belief in control persists. Humanity knows more than ever, but trusts itself too much. The lesson of the ancient fire was not that power should never be used, but that some forms of power exceed governance. Once unleashed, they act independently of intent. The ancient world learned this through irreversible loss. The later world risks learning it through repetition. Civilization now stands at a paradoxical point. It has inherited restraint without memory and power without humility. The balance that once ensured survival has tilted. Whether it can be corrected without catastrophe depends on reintegrating memory into decision-making. The ruins of the past offer no comfort, but they offer clarity. They show that stability is not proof of safety, that success does not equal wisdom, that systems can function perfectly until they fail completely. The ancient catastrophe reshaped humanity by force. The later world must reshape itself by choice. That choice requires acknowledging that progress without restraint is not advancement, but acceleration toward unknown consequence. The fire that once erased cities did not announce itself as destiny. It arrived as outcome. The same distinction holds now. What matters is not intention, but trajectory. History does not demand obedience, it offers evidence. The question is whether that evidence will be recognized as guidance or dismissed as relic. The answer will not be found in belief, but in what humanity chooses to slow down, limit, or refuse. The ancient lesson remains intact, waiting to be reclaimed before it must be relearned. As restraint weakened and confidence hardened into doctrine, civilization crossed into a phase where warning signs were no longer denied but normalized. Disruption became background noise. Environmental strain, social fragmentation, and systemic instability were acknowledged openly, yet treated as manageable side effects rather than existential signals. This normalization marked a decisive psychological shift. Danger no longer provoked reflection, it provoked adjustment. The ancient catastrophe had been sudden and undeniable. Its force collapsed meaning in an instant. Later, crises unfolded incrementally, allowing societies to adapt without stopping. Adaptation created the illusion of control. If systems could bend, then they did not need to break. This belief encouraged persistence along trajectories that would once have triggered retreat. Institutions evolved to manage symptoms rather than causes. Risk assessment became a profession. Models projected outcomes within acceptable margins. Contingency planning replaced prevention. Civilization learned to live with danger instead of avoiding it. The threshold of tolerable harm rose steadily. This change altered moral language. Terms like acceptable loss entered common use. Damage was quantified, balanced against benefit, and justified statistically. What could not be measured was often ignored. The ancient instinct to fear irreversible consequence was replaced by confidence in mitigation. Technology accelerated within this framework. Systems were built with fail-safes rather than limits. The assumption was that any failure could be corrected if detected early enough. This assumption ignored cascading effects, where correction itself introduces new instability. Complexity multiplied faster than comprehension. The environment absorbed these pressures unevenly. Some regions degraded rapidly. Others remained resilient. This unevenness allowed denial to persist. Those unaffected dismissed warnings as exaggeration, Those affected lacked influence to enforce change. Fragmentation protected the system from unified response. Cultural narratives adapted accordingly. Catastrophe was reframed as challenge. Collapse became transformation. Resilience replaced restraint as the dominant virtue. The goal shifted from avoiding disaster to surviving it. This reframing carried a subtle but profound implication. Disaster was now expected. Expectation reshaped behavior. When collapse is assumed inevitable, urgency shifts from prevention to advantage. Actors compete to position themselves favorably for disruption. Cooperation weakens. Short-term gains outweigh long-term stability. The social contract erodes quietly. The ancient catastrophe had united survivors in shared fear. Later crises divided populations along lines of exposure, belief, and interest. Without a single defining event, collective memory fractured. Each group interpreted danger differently, preventing consensus on response. Historical awareness struggled to bridge this divide. Scholars drew parallels to ancient collapses, pointing to patterns of overextension and ecological overshoot. These analyses circulated widely but rarely altered policy. Knowledge informed debate without changing direction. Insight became commentary. This separation between understanding and action marks a critical departure from earlier eras. The ancient world lacked explanation, but responded decisively once danger was undeniable. The later world possesses explanation, but delays response until danger becomes unavoidable. Awareness no longer guarantees restraint. Part of this delay stems from scale. Ancient societies operated within visible boundaries. Modern systems span continents and generations. Responsibility diffuses across time and space. No single decision appears decisive enough to reverse course. Inertia becomes the dominant force. Inertia favors existing power structures. Those who benefit most from current trajectories possess the greatest capacity to resist change. Calls for restraint are reframed as threats to stability or prosperity. The language of fear is inverted. Caution is portrayed as danger. This inversion mirrors patterns seen before ancient collapse. Warnings were interpreted as disruption. Urgency was dismissed as panic. The decisive moment arrived only after options narrowed beyond recovery. The lesson was not learned because it was not recognized in time. What differs now is complexity. Modern civilization is not a single system, but an interlocking network of systems. Failure in one propagates to others unpredictably. The ancient catastrophe destroyed cities. Modern equivalents threaten infrastructure, climate, and biosphere simultaneously. Despite this, belief in adaptability persists. Humanity trusts its ingenuity to compensate for consequence. Innovation is expected to solve problems created by innovation. This recursive optimism ignores limits imposed by physical systems that do not negotiate. The ancient catastrophe demonstrated such limits vividly. Once land was poisoned, no ingenuity restored it. Once cities were erased, no governance recovered them. Loss became permanent. This permanence contradicts modern assumptions of reversibility. Yet permanence is difficult to accept in a culture oriented toward growth. Acknowledging irreversible loss challenges foundational beliefs about progress and mastery. It forces confrontation with finitude, not only of resources, but of options. As these tensions mount, culture oscillates between urgency and distraction. Apocalyptic imagery resurfaces in entertainment and art, stripped of responsibility and consequence. Destruction becomes spectacle rather than warning. This aestheticization dulls fear while amplifying fascination. The ancient world also mythologized destruction, but its myths preserved fear. Modern myth often preserves excitement. The emotional signal has reversed. What once repelled now attracts. This shift carries risk. When catastrophe becomes entertainment, it loses its power to instruct. The lesson embedded in ancient annihilation becomes background noise, indistinguishable from fiction. Memory dissolves into imagery, yet physical reality remains indifferent to narrative. Systems fail according to laws, not stories. Ecological thresholds do not respond to belief. Once crossed, they impose conditions regardless of intention or interpretation. The ancient catastrophe imposed such conditions decisively. Its survivors adapted because they had no alternative. The later world still believes alternatives exist. This belief delays action until adaptation becomes compulsion. Whether compulsion will arrive gently or violently remains unknown. History offers both possibilities. What it does not offer is exemption. No civilization escapes consequence indefinitely. The ancient lesson was simple and brutal. Power without restraint reshapes the world beyond repair. Later generations inherited that lesson indirectly, filtered through culture and myth. As memory thins, the lesson weakens, but the principle endures. Civilization now approaches a familiar pattern from a new angle. The mechanisms differ. The scale is larger, the speed is faster, but the structure is recognizable. Confidence rises, warnings multiply, action lags. The ruins of the past do not predict the future. They clarify possibility. They show what happens when systems exceed their limits. They demonstrate that collapse is not a moral failure, but a structural outcome. Recognizing this does not require fear. It requires sobriety. The ancient world lacked the language for restraint, but learned it through devastation. The modern world possesses the language but risks ignoring it. Whether restraint will be rediscovered as wisdom or reimposed by consequence remains undecided. The past does not choose, it only informs. The ancient catastrophe still speaks, not as prophecy, but as precedent. It reminds civilization that survival is not guaranteed by intelligence alone, but by the willingness to stop before stopping becomes impossible. When the pressure of accumulated risk finally becomes impossible to ignore, societies tend to react in one of two ways: radical restraint or radical acceleration. History shows that acceleration is usually chosen first. It feels decisive. It promises control. It delays sacrifice. This pattern is not new. It echoes the final moments before the ancient catastrophe, when urgency overwhelmed caution and decisive action was mistaken for wise action. At this stage, civilization reframes danger as challenge. Problems are no longer signals to slow down, but incentives to push harder. Scarcity inspires extraction. Instability inspires consolidation. Environmental stress inspires technological intervention. Each response compounds complexity, increasing dependence on systems already under strain. The ancient world reached a similar point when internal conflict and perceived disorder justified the use of overwhelming force. The intention was stabilization. The result was annihilation. That outcome was not caused by evil intent, but by misjudgment of scale and consequence. The same misjudgment remains humanity's most persistent weakness. Modern decision-making environments amplify this weakness. Layers of abstraction separate cause from effect. Data replaces experience. Models replace intuition. Risk is managed through probability rather than memory. This creates confidence that catastrophe can be calculated away. Yet catastrophic systems do not fail linearly. They fail abruptly when thresholds are crossed invisibly. The ancient catastrophe followed this pattern. Stability persisted until it did not. The moment of transition was sudden, irreversible, and misunderstood by those who caused it. Today's systems show similar characteristics. Climate, infrastructure, financial networks, and ecological webs all contain tipping points. They appear resilient until they are not. When failure occurs, it propagates faster than response. This is not speculation. It is observable structure. Despite this, belief in recovery remains strong. Civilization tells itself that adaptation is infinite, that innovation can always compensate. This belief rests on past successes achieved under different conditions. It assumes that future environments will allow similar recovery. The ancient catastrophe demonstrates the flaw in that assumption. After the fire, recovery was partial and uneven. Some regions adapted, others were lost permanently. Progress continued elsewhere, but not everywhere. Civilization survived by contraction, not by restoration. That distinction matters. Modern discourse often ignores contraction as a viable outcome. Loss is framed as unacceptable. Growth is treated as non-negotiable. This rigidity increases vulnerability. Systems that cannot shrink without collapsing are brittle by design. The ancient world learned flexibility through collapse. Survivors became smaller, more mobile, and less ambitious. They traded scale for resilience. The modern world resists this trade, preferring to maintain scale at all costs. That preference increases the likelihood of systemic failure. Cultural narratives struggle to address this reality. Stories emphasize triumph over adversity, not avoidance of it. Collapse is framed as villain rather than consequence. Responsibility is externalized. These narratives comfort, but they do not instruct. Yet beneath cultural noise, instinct stirs. Anxiety rises. People sense imbalance even if they cannot articulate it. Trust in permanence erodes. Institutions feel fragile. This mirrors the psychological atmosphere preceding ancient collapse, when confidence coexisted with unease. The difference now is visibility. Information about risk is widespread. The challenge is not ignorance, but coordination. Knowing what to do does not guarantee collective ability to do it. This gap between knowledge and action is itself a risk factor. The ancient catastrophe bypassed coordination entirely. A small group made a decisive choice that affected everyone. The modern world distributes power more widely, but not evenly. Decision-making remains concentrated, while consequences are shared. This imbalance complicates restraint. When restraint does appear, it is often reactive rather than proactive. Damage must become visible before limits are imposed. By then, options have narrowed. This pattern repeats across domains, reinforcing the lesson that delay is costly. The ancient world paid that cost once and reorganized around it. The modern world risks paying it on a scale without historical precedent. The ancient catastrophe reshaped regions. A modern equivalent would reshape the planet. This possibility does not require imagination. It requires recognition of structural similarity. Power concentration, complexity, denial, and delayed response are not historical accidents. They are recurring features of advanced systems. The ancient lesson does not demand fear-driven paralysis. It demands conscious limitation. It demands choosing not to use every capability simply because it exists. It demands valuing continuity over dominance. These demands conflict with deeply ingrained narratives of progress and competition. Changing them requires cultural transformation, not technical solution. It requires redefining success. Success in this reframed context is not expansion, speed, or control. It is stability across generations. It is the ability to pass on a livable world rather than an impressive one. The ancient survivors understood this implicitly. They rebuilt smaller. They remembered boundaries. They encoded restraint into law and myth. Those systems endured because they aligned with reality. The modern world must rediscover that alignment intentionally. There is no guarantee of second chances. The ancient catastrophe left scars that never healed. Future scars may be larger and deeper. The past does not offer prophecy. It offers pattern. That pattern shows that civilizations rarely collapse because they lack intelligence. They collapse because intelligence is deployed without restraint. Whether humanity chooses restraint now will determine whether the ancient catastrophe remains a historical anomaly or becomes a recurring chapter. The choice exists, but it is narrowing. The fire that once erased cities did not ask permission. It followed consequence. The same principle governs all systems governed by physics rather than belief. History does not threaten. It demonstrates. The rest depends on whether demonstration is recognized before replication occurs. What is certain is that the ancient lesson still applies. It always has. The only variable is whether it will be honored voluntarily or imposed once again by irreversible outcome. As the accumulation of unresolved pressure reached a critical density, civilization entered a moment where choice narrowed into posture. The question was no longer whether restraint was necessary, but whether restraint could still be enacted without collapse. History shows that when systems delay moderation too long, moderation begins to resemble surrender, and surrender becomes politically impossible. At this stage, power tends to defend itself through escalation, disguised as solution. Complex problems invite complex fixes. Each fix introduces new dependencies, locking society deeper into the very systems creating instability. What appears as progress is often entrenchment. What appears as control is often acceleration toward thresholds already crossed. The ancient catastrophe followed this logic precisely. Faced with disorder, authority sought decisive resolution rather than structural adjustment. The chosen response promised finality, clarity, and restored order. Instead, it erased the conditions that made order possible. The modern world risks repeating this pattern through different mechanisms, but identical reasoning. The belief that collapse can be managed after it begins remains one of the most dangerous assumptions inherited from partial memory. Ancient survivors did not manage collapse, they endured it. Survival came through contraction, loss, and adaptation to a diminished world. That reality is absent from modern narratives of resilience, which often confuse endurance with continuity. Continuity is not guaranteed. Systems optimized for efficiency lack buffers. When disruption exceeds tolerance, they fail rapidly. This is not moral judgment, it is mechanical outcome. The ancient cities were efficient hubs of agriculture and trade. Their efficiency magnified their vulnerability. When they fell completely. Modern civilization mirrors this structure at a global scale. Supply chains, energy grids, and information networks are interconnected tightly enough that local disruption propagates systemically. Redundancy has been minimized in the name of optimization. The result is fragility disguised as sophistication. Despite this, dominant narratives continue to equate restraint with regression. Slowing down is framed as weakness. Limitation is portrayed as fear. This framing discourages proactive reduction of risk, ensuring that adjustment only occurs under duress. The ancient world lacked the conceptual tools to describe systemic risk, but it recognized outcome. After destruction, survivors reorganized instinctively around reduced scale. They learned that survival did not require dominance, only balance. Their success lay not in restoring what was lost, but in refusing to repeat what caused it. The modern world, by contrast, seeks restoration without reduction. Loss is treated as unacceptable. The goal becomes preservation of scale rather than preservation of life-supporting systems. This inversion increases the likelihood that both scale and systems will be lost. Cultural signals reflect this tension. Anxiety rises even amid abundance. Confidence coexists with dread. People sense instability without agreeing on cause. This diffuse unease mirrors the psychological environment preceding ancient collapse, when normalcy persisted alongside unspoken fear. In response, societies often retreat into narratives of inevitability. If collapse is unavoidable, responsibility dissolves. Action feels pointless. This fatalism is not ancient wisdom. It is modern paralysis. The ancient catastrophe was not inevitable. It was the result of choice made under pressure without humility. Humility remains the missing variable. Intelligence alone does not produce restraint. Awareness alone does not prevent excess. Only humility, the recognition of limits without needing proof, creates space for sustainable decision-making. This humility requires accepting that some capabilities should remain unused, that not every problem demands maximal intervention, that doing less can sometimes preserve more. These ideas conflict with deeply ingrained assumptions about progress. The ancient survivors internalized these principles through trauma. They did not articulate them philosophically. They lived them practically. Their laws, myths, and customs encoded reduction as wisdom. Over generations, this wisdom diluted into tradition, then into superstition, and finally into forgetfulness. The modern world must reconstruct that wisdom consciously without the catalyst of annihilation. This is unprecedented. No civilization has ever chosen large-scale restraint voluntarily after achieving high complexity. The challenge is not technical, but cultural. Cultural change operates slowly, while systemic risk accelerates. This mismatch creates urgency without clarity. Calls for moderation compete with incentives for expansion. Short-term reward outweighs long-term stability in most decision frameworks. Yet history offers a narrow window where correction remains possible. Before irreversible thresholds are crossed, systems can be simplified, dependencies can be reduced, scale can be moderated. These actions feel counterintuitive, but align with survival patterns observed after ancient collapse. The reluctance to pursue such actions stems from identity. Modern civilization defines itself through growth. To limit growth feels like erasing purpose. The ancient world defined itself through continuity. That difference explains divergent outcomes. Continuity prioritizes transmission. What can be passed on matters more than what can be achieved. Growth prioritizes accumulation. What can be gained matters more than what can be sustained. When these values collide with finite systems, continuity outlasts growth. The ancient catastrophe forced a shift toward continuity. The modern world resists that shift, despite recognizing its necessity. This resistance is the defining tension of the current moment. The land still offers instruction. Dead zones remain dead. Collapsed ecosystems do not rebound fully. These outcomes are not theoretical. They demonstrate the cost of exceeding limits. Ignore them does not negate them. The ancient fire did not need belief to reshape reality. It required only conditions. The same principle governs modern risks. They operate independently of ideology. They respond to physics, not narrative. What remains uncertain is whether humanity will choose to honor inherited limits before those limits assert themselves through consequence. The ancient world learned through loss. The modern world has the option to learn through recognition. Recognition requires integrating history not as metaphor, but as precedent. It requires understanding that the past is not primitive because it lacked language, but instructive because it lacked denial. The lesson embedded in the ancient catastrophe is not pessimism. It is realism. It states that systems collapse when pushed beyond tolerance, regardless of intention. It warns that survival depends on respecting thresholds before crossing them. Whether this lesson will guide future decisions remains undecided. Civilization stands at a point where restraint is still possible, but increasingly costly. Delay narrows options. Momentum resists change. The ancient survivors did not debate restraint. They lived within it because they had no alternative. The modern world still has alternatives, but fewer with each passing moment. History does not repeat exact events. It repeats structures. The structure now is familiar. The outcome is not predetermined, but the conditions are recognizable. The ancient catastrophe remains silent but present, offering its lesson without demand. What humanity does with that lesson will define whether restraint becomes a chosen wisdom or an enforced aftermath. At the far edge of the long arc shaped by the ancient catastrophe, civilization arrives not at an ending, but at a reckoning with continuity itself. What began as fire, silence, and poisoned land has become a mirror held up to every advanced system that follows. The mirror does not reflect destiny, it reflects structure. Across millennia, the same pattern has unfolded with variations in language, technology, and scale. Power concentrates, complexity increases, confidence replaces caution, warnings are acknowledged but deferred. Adjustment arrives too late to prevent irreversible change. This is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of restraint under success. The ancient catastrophe stripped away illusion violently. Cities vanished in moments. Land died for generations. Survivors rebuilt smaller, slower, and more cautiously, not because they idealized restraint, but because reality enforced it. Their wisdom was practical, born of loss rather than theory. Later civilizations inherited the outcomes of that wisdom without inheriting its origin. Boundaries persisted, but their purpose faded. Limits became habits. Habits became obstacles. Obstacles became targets for removal. This gradual erosion did not announce itself as danger. It felt like progress. By the time restraint was questioned openly, capability had already expanded beyond earlier thresholds. Systems grew so large and interdependent that reversing course threatened collapse. The paradox emerged clearly. The more powerful civilization became, the harder it was to choose limitation without destabilization. This paradox defines the present condition. Humanity possesses unprecedented capacity to alter environments, societies, and even planetary systems. At the same time, it remains bound by physical laws that do not negotiate. The gap between what can be done and what can be absorbed has narrowed dramatically. The ancient catastrophe demonstrated what happens when that gap is ignored. Once exceeded, systems do not fail gracefully. They collapse into new, diminished equilibria. Recovery, if it occurs, is partial and uneven. Loss becomes permanent. This outcome does not require malice. It requires momentum unchecked by humility. Modern civilization stands within that same dynamic. The mechanisms differ, but the structure aligns. Scale amplifies consequence. Speed compresses response time. Complexity obscures causality. Together, these factors recreate conditions where restraint feels increasingly costly and increasingly necessary. Cultural memory struggles under this pressure. Stories and warnings persist, but they compete with incentives that reward acceleration. Immediate benefit outweighs abstract future cost. This imbalance skews decision-making toward continuation rather than correction. Yet beneath surface narratives, deeper instincts remain. Anxiety grows alongside achievement. Trust in permanence erodes even as structures expand. People sense fragility without consensus on cause. This unease mirrors the psychological environment before ancient collapse, when stability masked vulnerability. What distinguishes the present from the past is awareness. Patterns are visible. Data accumulates. Precedent exists. The ancient catastrophe is no longer isolated myth or archaeology. It is comparative evidence. It shows that collapse is not anomalous, but structural. This awareness offers opportunity, but not assurance. Knowing patterns does not guarantee avoidance. Recognition must translate into restraint, and restraint must be chosen before it becomes enforced. Enforced restraint arrives through consequence. It arrives as contraction, loss, and adaptation under duress. The ancient survivors did not debate reduction. They accepted it because alternatives no longer existed. Their world shrank, but it persisted. Voluntary restraint requires a different mindset. It requires redefining success away from expansion and toward continuity. It requires valuing what can be sustained over what can be achieved. It demands sacrifice without immediate reward. Such demands run counter to dominant narratives of progress. Growth has become synonymous with meaning. Limitation feels like failure. Yet history demonstrates that unchecked growth leads not to triumph, but to correction imposed by reality. The ancient catastrophe imposed that correction brutally. Its lesson was not moral, but mechanical. Systems pushed beyond tolerance break. No intention, belief, or justification alters that outcome. The modern world must internalize this lesson without reliving it. That task is unprecedented. No civilization has attempted large-scale voluntary restraint after reaching high complexity. Success would represent a genuine evolutionary step in social organization. Failure would not be novel. It would be repetition with variation. The ancient fire erased cities. A modern equivalent would erase systems upon which billions depend. The scale of consequence has expanded alongside capacity. The land still remembers. Dead zones remain. Ecosystems altered beyond recovery persist as quiet testimony. These outcomes do not accuse. They inform. They demonstrate that some changes reduce possibility permanently. Civilization now holds knowledge capable of preventing repetition, but also capability capable of amplifying it. Which path dominates depends not on intelligence, but on humility operationalized into policy, culture, and habit. Humility, in this context, does not mean retreat into fear or stagnation. It means recognizing that not every capability must be exercised. That restraint is not weakness, but alignment with reality. That survival across generations outweighs short-term dominance. The ancient survivors lived this truth instinctively. They rebuilt within limits because limits were undeniable. The modern world must choose limits consciously without the forcing mechanism of annihilation. This choice will not be dramatic. It will not arrive as single decision or event. It will manifest through countless refusals, not to accelerate, not to optimize beyond resilience, not to extract beyond regeneration, not to centralize beyond governance. Each refusal appears small. Collectively, they define trajectory. The ancient catastrophe resulted from accumulation of unchallenged choices. Avoidance will require accumulation of conscious ones. History offers no guarantees. It offers pattern recognition. It shows that civilizations do not fail because they lack solutions, but because they reject limits. It shows that collapse is not punishment, but consequence. The ancient fire is no longer visible in the sky, but its imprint remains embedded in civilization's architecture, ethics, and anxiety. It whispers that survival is not automatic, and that continuity must be chosen repeatedly. Whether humanity will choose that continuity before consequence imposes, it remains uncertain. The window for choice exists, but it narrows as momentum builds. The final lesson of the ancient catastrophe is neither despair nor prophecy. It is agency. It reveals that outcomes are shaped long before they arrive, through patterns that can be recognized and altered. Civilization stands where memory and possibility intersect. The past has spoken clearly, even if quietly. What remains is whether its lesson will be honored as wisdom or rediscovered as aftermath.